Hello and welcome. We'll give people a couple of moments here to join. Hello and welcome. We're going to give people just a couple of moments to join. Welcome everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. All right. We'll go ahead and get started now. Hello and welcome to the 2020 installment of the INSAR Institute. I'm Alana McVeigh, a clinical psychology intern in the Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorders track at UCLA and a doctoral candidate at Marquette University. I am also the INSAR Student and Trainee Committee co-chair. The INSAR Institute is a 6-week online series presented by the International Society for Autism Research. I would like to recognize and thank the INSAR Board of Directors for their support of our annual series. I would also like to thank the INSAR Student and Trainee Committee and all of our working group members for their dedication to bringing this series to life. The INSAR Institute sessions are free to attend live to anyone who has created a My INSAR account. Today's session was capped at 500 attendees. Sessions are recorded and available for replay following the event to INSAR members. Each year, we aim to highlight a new area or concept in autism research with the hope of focusing on issues that are important to you, our attendees. The goal of the INSAR Institute is to provide a forum for the presentation and discussion of autism-related research topics that is accessible for people new to the field. While the INSAR Institute was originally created for early career researchers to provide ongoing training and mentorship opportunities, we are excited to welcome all who may find the series informative. We hope that the INSAR Institute provides an opportunity for scientists and stakeholders with different backgrounds and from around the world to have meaningful conversations and ultimately advance our understanding of autism. This year's INSAR Institute has the overarching theme, Developmental Stages of Autism Through a Research Lens. The aim of this series is to focus on understanding facilitators and barriers that influence autistic people's transition through different life stages, integrating research and clinical practice. Broadening our understanding of autism across the lifespan also has implications for policymaking to ensure that autistic people reach their full potential in an increasingly neurodiverse society. We are very excited to present this year's lineup with presentations and conversations regarding the developmental stages of autism. Today is the first session in our series and features a presentation from distinguished professor Dr. Catherine Lord, who will be speaking with us about working with autistic individuals across the lifespan, current perspectives. Before we get started, know that you can ask questions for our presenter at any time. There will be plenty of time for Dr. Lord to answer questions after the presentation. Ask a question at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A period. If you see that your question has been dismissed, that simply means we've recorded it and have added it to the list to ask after the presentation. You can also use the chat function to chat with others during the presentation. But if you ask questions there, we may miss them, so please make sure you use the Q&A box. We will reserve the last few minutes of the Q&A for Dr. Lord to answer questions about career development. You can post your questions about career development topics in the Q&A box at any time as well. We would greatly appreciate your feedback after the session. Please take a few moments to tell us about your experience today. An email with a survey link will be sent out shortly after the session. If you have not yet downloaded the background materials, you can find them at autism-insar.org/page/SI2020 sessions. These materials define some of the key terms and provide further resources. As with all of the INSAR Institute sessions, a group of students and trainees worked with the presenter to prepare the course materials. Our working group members are here today. I'd like to introduce Hillary Schultz, who is a PhD candidate in clinical psychology at Marquette University and who received her master's degree in child development from the University of California, Davis. She is also an INSAR Student and Trainee Committee member. Another working group member joining us today is Dr. Marika Kaufman. Dr. Kaufman is a postdoctoral clinical research fellow at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. She completed her clinical internship at Nationwide Children's Hospital in 2019 and received her PhD in clinical psychology from Virginia Tech in 2019. Dr. Kaufman is our INSAR Student and Trainee Committee Chair. I will now introduce our speaker for today's session. We are lucky to have an incredible autism expert and world-renowned speaker today, Dr. Catherine Lord. Dr. Lord is the George Tarjan Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Education at the Semel Institute of Neuroscience and Human Behavior in the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. She is a practicing clinical psychologist whose primary focus is autism and related disorders across the lifespan, from toddlers through adulthood. Her research and clinical work have involved the development of diagnostic instruments that describe individual profiles of skills and weaknesses, and carrying out longitudinal studies from age 15 months up to 26 years, with the goal of identifying protective and risk factors that influence milestones of progress over the years. She is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and a fellow of the American Association of Arts and Sciences. I will now turn it over to Dr. Lord for her talk entitled Working with Autistic Individuals Across the Lifespan, Current Perspectives. Thank you for joining us and welcome, Dr. Lord.
Thanks, Alana, and thank you very much, the whole committee, Hillary, Marika, and Alana, for all your support. I am very happy to be here. I want to say hello to everybody and hope you are safe and considering all the things that are going on around us. I also want to say right at the start that what I'll talk about is work done by many, many people, but two people who are critical, particularly in making figures and doing the analyses, are Andrew Pickles, who is a statistician from King's College London, and Jamie Macaulay, who was a postdoc here now at St. Mary's College. I also do need to say I do get royalties from the diagnostic instruments. And am a member of several different scientific advisory boards listed here. I have funding from a variety of agencies. Nobody, though, is responsible for what I'm saying. This is just me. So what I'm going to do today is talk particularly about a longitudinal study that we've been doing that began with consecutive referrals of kids under age 3 initially to the TEACH program and then to a program at University of Chicago. These participants are now just turning 30. I'm going to talk about data up to age 26, which is the last time we've collected a full sample, and initially begin with talking about what people are doing now. Then I'm going to go back and talk about trajectories from the time that they were little and across a variety of different ages, talk a little bit about the transitions that we happen to be able to catch in our study, and then try to focus on how can we use this information to help families and do a better job ourselves as clinicians working with children with autism and their families and also adults. And really the main question here is, can we use the things that we discovered are milestones in development or predictors not necessarily the same thing, as better targets or ways of measuring in what direction are we moving and should we change directions in terms of services and treatments. So in our longitudinal study, we started out with 213 people. We've seen people face-to-face at 2, 3, some at 4, some at 5, almost everyone at 9, 19, 26, and then 30. I think one of the important things to note is that we do have, although on the whole, the diagnosis of autism is quite stable. But we do have people who moved out of the spectrum, people who had clear diagnoses of ASD. And then at age 5, we had one child. At age 9, another child. We have independent diagnoses each time we see people. So the teams that go in do not know about previous diagnoses. We had 8 people at 19 who would not have been called autistic if you just went by current characteristics, even though technically they could still have autism by history, and 5 more at 26. So my point here is that there are people who do move out of the spectrum, although it's by far not the majority. And what's interesting is we have a control group of people referred for autism who never got a diagnosis, and we have a small control group of people who had neurodevelopmental disorders at 2, but not autism, whom we've also followed, yet some of them have also moved into autism. And again, you'll see here the numbers are small, but it does happen. I think one of the main points I want to make just at the start, and then I won't belabor it, is that the outcomes of these comparison participants, people who also had neurodevelopmental disorders, they're a heterogeneous group, are not that different from the outcomes. Okay, why is this not going forward? Uh-oh. There we go. Of the people with autism. So if you just look at these figures, this is looking at who is working. We divided up the ASD group. This is on the basis of IQ at age 19 into a higher IQ group, which is on the left, high with ASD, a lower IQ group, which is IQs below 70, and then people who never had ASD. And the point here is, and white would mean working in full-time employment. The point here is, first of all, IQ has a far greater effect than autism. But secondly, that if you compare the leftmost column and the rightmost column for working, living independently, even friendship and daily living skills, there are not huge differences between this group of never ASD, but clearly having neurodevelopmental disorders. So I think one of the things we need to remember is that autism isn't completely unique. Same thing, these are ADOS scores at age 26. We have ASD high IQ. Darker means a more severe score. This is ASD lower IQ and never ASD. You can see there's a significant number of people who've never had an ASD diagnosis who do get relatively high ADOS scores. But this is current ADI scores with parent report. And you'll see that the parents describe the ASD high IQ people as much more limited than the never ASD. And we don't know if the difference between the ADI and the ASD, the ADI are what they're describing, or whether it's that parents remember their kids and continue to see them as having ASD, even when many of them are not any more severe than these never ASD people here. Lastly,
I apologize for the interruption, Dr. Lord.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of shifting sunlight. We're sorry to lose the beautiful trees in the background. Thank you.
Let's pull the curtain.
Thank you very much.
How's that?
I think that'll be great.
Okay, sorry.
No problem at all. Thank you.
So this is the same issues with co-occurring disorders. You will see that they're higher in the ASD high IQ than either of the other groups, predominantly anxiety and depression. But they also occur in the never ASD, hyperactivity highest in the low ASD. CBCL actually didn't work terribly well in terms of differentiating these groups. And then number of medications, you can see the low IQ ASD group by far was on the greatest number of medications, but actually the never ASD group also had a significant number. So, I mean, you can say, and I remember years ago having arguments with geneticists about whether we even need autism, and at that point arguing vociferously that we do. I think we still do need this concept. We can't just fold everything into social communication and say that many people with developmental disabilities have social communication difficulties, because people with autism were unique in some ways. If you control for IQ, their adaptive scores are worse than other groups. So that the difference between their capability in a cognitive test without a lot of social demands and adaptive skills in the community is greater compared to other neurodevelopmental disorders. They do have fewer friendships and other social relationships. One of the interesting things was that people with autism were much less likely than people with other neurodevelopmental disorders to have placements in supported employment. Medication, as you saw, was higher in the low IQ. And I think one of the things we learned here was that the ADAS severity score as an adult was actually often more predictive than whether somebody actually got a diagnosis of autism or not. So there are subtle differences that we probably could do a better job of measuring. And the sort of next point is there's a huge diversity within autism. When you start with 2-year-olds, the kids don't all look the same, but there's much less variability. But by the time you get to 26, first of all, by intellectual disability, somebody with moderate to severe disability is just in a very different situation and facing different presses than a person with closer to average or average intelligence. There are also bigger differences, as I've said, in autism severity, including both repetitive behaviors and social communication skills, differences in co-occurring disorders, and then the reality of resources, which I'm not going to talk about very much, but is also something we can't ignore. So this circle represents all of our sample at age 26. And what you can see here is that, and I should say very carefully, this is a sample of consecutive referrals at age 2. So it's a good clinical sample at age 2, but it's not the same as an epidemiological sample. It's definitely not the same as a clinical sample. If you took your clinics today and took 2-year-olds, you would have many more kids who don't have intellectual disability than we saw from 28 years ago. It's also different than the clinical samples you get of adults now, because many of the clinical samples of adults are people coming forward because they need help. This is not a group who's seeking us out. We have tracked them down and they've graciously tolerated us since they were 2. So in many ways, they actually have fewer comorbidities than you would see in a clinical sample of adults who are seeking help at even a university-based clinic. So one important thing is, if we look here, this is all the people who have low IQs, below 70. And their mean IQ actually is about 30. So it's very low. We really have a bimodal distribution. These are all the people who have higher IQs. I'm sounding like I'm obsessed with IQ, which is not true, but it's just a way to start. Their average IQ is 100. So again, this is a very bimodal group. And what you can see here, though, is of the full group, 12% are people who really seem to have moved out of autism. We have another 7% of people who still have autistic features, but are doing very well. And the group we really worry about is this 24% of cognitively able people who are still struggling, as well as the people with lower cognitive skills. I put this in just because we received this a couple years ago. This is our first participant who is married, a young man with autism, who this is his wedding invitation, who still considers himself as having autism, but is independent, graduated from college, married, has a family, his own place to live, and is doing really well. So one of our attempts to describe different ways of how you could calculate outcome was a latent class analysis done by Andrew Pickles. And what Andrew did was he took our full sample, put in over here on the right, you'll see work, living, friends, daily living. These are the objective measures of outcome. So he started with this and then also put in CSS from the ADOS, IQ, and then a range of measures about both quality of life, like well-being, a PANA score, as well as comorbidities. So the ABC, CBCL, VDI. And what was generated were 4 groups. I think this is a little bit hard to follow, but what's most important is along the bottom line with the little dots and circles. These are the people doing the best. And you can see that they have, and lower is better. So they have low ADOS scores, high IQs. The one thing they're high on is BDIs. So they do show, this is not within the clinical range, but relatively high depression. And this is the PANIS, so they are somewhat negative about themselves. And then here they are working, living independently, they have friends, and relatively good adaptive skills. In this group, it's about half people who had autism as a child and the other half people who've never had autism. Up at the top with the triangles and the black lines is the group that has the most difficulty. These people have an average IQ in the 20s. They have very high irritability and hyperactivity. They're not described as depressed, so that's why it's down here. But they are the most dependent of any of the groups. What's probably most interesting is the 2 groups in the middle. This group here with the spaced lines and little crosses is a group with also high CSS, so high autism, but good IQs. IQs really in the 90s, but high comorbidity. And if you look over on the right here with working, living, friends, they're very similar to the group right above it, which is people with IQs of 40, but without the comorbidities. So the point here is a couple different things. One, we thought that well-being and subjective accounts would travel with independence, and that was not necessarily the case. Secondly, IQ had a huge effect, as even stronger than autism, although the CSS also was predictive. And then differentiating the people in the middle was primarily by these comorbidities. So I wanted to just give you an example because I felt like I couldn't post videos to such a large audience of just 2 people who are more cognitively able and the different things that have happened in their lives. So Bobby was 2 when we met him. He initially had a nonverbal IQ of 90. He was a kid who was a whiz at puzzles. A verbal IQ of 60, which is at 2 meant that he had some words. He was very anxious, upset, difficult. He was a beautiful little guy with lovely parents who just had very set ideas on what he was going to do. And it was quite hard to convince him to do other things. His parents jumped into all kinds of different interventions. He started in a preschool. At 3, he began to talk, but he really didn't have sentences. And I remember a horrible time with them where they realized that I thought his language would have been better, and it wasn't. He had a lot of echoing. He was still anxious, but calmer, still many needs for sameness, but loved school and seemed pretty settled. It's just that his language wasn't coming. By 5, he had sentences, but still very rote language, continued to have great puzzle skills and spatial skills. He could read. He had the same problems, but was doing well in school, although they had a hard time directing his attention. And he had a number of siblings, and he began to be interested in them, which he wasn't at 2, and loved to play with them, and they were so patient. At 9, his language again hadn't changed much. He was very good at math and computation, not word problems. He hated to write, no longer liked to read, and it was very hard to find the right school program in a relatively small school district. So his parents eventually pulled him out of the school and had him go to a private special ed school. At 14, his language was better. He had sentences. His academics were not good, but he had discovered computer coding, and he started editing films. He was much happier, but he still had relatively poor judgment, although he was pretty happy. And there was an incident where his parents had let him go home alone from school and told him not to let anyone in the house. And his aunt, who was an identical twin to his mom, came over to see if he was all right, and he would not let her in the house, which just is an example of he really took rules seriously, but didn't have a lot of sense about it. At 19, he was still in school, was very bored, done with school, but much the same, doing a lot of things around the house. And again, here are his test scores. And at 26, what's sad is he's now home alone. His mom is working, his dad is working, his sibs are all gone, and he's gotten odder because he's home alone. He's on more medicine, and nobody can find quite what the right thing is to do, although he can make lovely computer animations. So in contrast, we have Tom, who started nearly identical at the same point, but between 2 and 3, for Tommy, his language came. He wasn't at age level by 3 or even by 5, except for vocabulary, but it began to shoot up. He had flexible sentences. And by the time he was 9, he was in regular school. It turned out he was really quite a gifted athlete. And so he started swimming. And by 19, he was an engineering student in college with very high IQs. So he is a very bright young man. At 2, he really wasn't that different than Bobby, except that he wasn't perhaps quite as tense. But this young man now, at 26, is living independently. He has a steady girlfriend. He will say, yes, he does have autism, but mostly he doesn't need it, doesn't tell anybody about it, but it's not a big secret. So what's the difference here? And I think one of the things we've been talking about, which other people have definitely addressed, is what is a good outcome for a verbally fluent young adult with ASD? And I should say about Bobby that he is now verbally fluent, barely, but not to the degree that the other young man is. So we decided we would use as our definition, we took, working from the World Health Organization, basically participation in the community, so full-time employment or age-appropriate education, social relationships, so one truly reciprocal friendship at least, and then living independently, which we realize is complicated, especially these days. And then no major mental illness and self-reports of happiness. And this is work by Jamie McCauley. Each tile is a person. If you look along the bottom, you'll see green tiles mean that met our highest standards. So all the green tiles are people who have a real friendship. And then on the right, the pink tiles are people who are in the sort of worst case scenario, no friends. And then the 2 in the middle are having some acquaintances. To move down to current living, green is living independently. The orange is one person who lives in a group home. And the blue are living with parents. So the majority of our population at 26 were still living with parents. And then work, we have the majority of people are in work, but many people who are still, about 1/3 of the sample are still looking for work, working in special centers, have supported employment, which is the goal orange, or not doing anything. If we put all these things together, we do have about a third of the sample who are really doing well on all accounts. But we also have about a quarter of the sample who is really struggling in every way. And there's just no reason why that should be the case. So we then asked, what is a good outcome for a young adult who still has minimal verbal skills, who doesn't have flexible language? And we decided along the same lines, we would define it in terms of having something to do each day, somewhere to go outside the home. Self-help skills at about an 8-year-old level. We picked 8 because at least on the Vineland, which is what our data is from, that covers hygiene, so nobody has to wash you or bathe you, and a few chores. And then some kind of relationship with somebody who likes the person with autism and whom she or she wants to see regularly beyond immediate family, that they do see on a regular basis. So this is not someone paid to be there and not a family member. And again, you could define this in many ways. And then again, lack of marked anxiety and aggression, and parents describe happiness and well-being. So just to give you examples here, Ian at 2 had no language at all, didn't seem to understand any words, had lower scores on a Mullen, although it was very hard to get him to do anything. And he was the kind of kid who would really just walk by you, who really was not interested in anybody actually, but his mother, not particularly interested in toys. By 3, he had no words. He could follow a point. He had little play. He was in a good preschool program, an all-day preschool program. And his parents were really optimistic that things were much better. He was much more attentive to people, but continued to have quite low cognitive scores. By 5, he had about 15 words and a few rote phrases. He was very good at simple puzzles, and he liked doing repetitive kinds of activities. He could write his name. He was in a school program that he loved. Everyone was quite happy with his progress. And 9, again, more rote phrases, not much more spontaneous language, had developed some good adaptive skills, was really taking care of his clothes and hygiene, loved schools, did still like to line things up and wanted things in particular ways, but quite happy. At 19, he was in a supported employment through school. He was just a very nice young man, and everyone liked him. And he was actually living with his grandparents and helping to take care of them because he could do things like do laundry and load the dishwasher. He still had many routines, but some flexibility. And then everything fell apart because one of his grandparents became ill. The other one eventually died. He moved back in with his mom and other kids. That didn't work. Ended up in a group home where he had aggressive behavior, which he had never actually had. And we were very concerned about depression. So in contrast, Shelley, who was very similar to him at age 2, but actually more sociable, she also didn't seem to have any receptive or expressive language, had low scores on the Mullen. By 3, she had some words. She was calmer and happier, and she was receiving a lot of one-to-one ABA. At 5, they tried to put her in a regular kindergarten, and it was just a disaster. And when you looked at the testing, she was still definitely in the range of moderate to severe intellectual disability. So they moved into a teach classroom at 9 and was doing very well. But now at 19, she was at home and nobody could find anything for her to do. She became increasingly agitated and really pretty miserable until her parents found her a spot in a local group home that's located in a farm, and now she loves it. So she loves animals, she loves being outdoors, and is much more settled. So similar to what we did with the more cognitively able people, you can see here that if we go down around the bottom, about half of our group had friends. That is, these could be people that they lived with or worked with or people that just visited. But about a little bit less than half of the group had daily living skills at an 8-year-old level. And then current activities is where we really suffer. We have about 60% of the group really still have nothing to do, which is just horrendous. And if we look up here, compared to the more able people, we have far fewer where we feel like we've covered everything. And we have more people who are really struggling. So these are issues. It's not to pit more able against less able, it's just that they're different issues. We also looked at subjective outcomes and happiness. And for this, we have had their poor parents of all of these people filling out forms, including the PANIS, which is a list of positive adjectives and negative adjectives, various forms about well-being and quality of life. And when we analyzed these, we did come up with basically a positive well-being happiness factor that was relevant both for the less verbal young adults and the more verbal adults, and very similar. And then the second factor we came up with when we put in all the different measures of co-occurring conditions, for less verbal adults, the issues had to do with externalizing and aggression and agitation, irritability, hyperactivity. For more verbal adults, the issues had to do with mood, depression, and anxiety. And I think one thing to note is that the self-reports of the more verbal adults, people tended to report themselves as happier and as having better well-being than their parents reported them, but they also reported themselves as more depressed. So we did find relationships between these subjective outcomes and the objective measures that I just showed you from Jamie with the little tiles in terms of independence. The issue is we don't know what predicts what. We don't know if you're happier because you have work, or if you have the reason you got work was because you're easier to get along with and happier. And that's something that we hope to follow up, because we have these measures now across adulthood starting at 19 and we'll have them into the 30s. So then we want to look back to factors that predicted where are people now, and what could we predict when people were 2 and 3, when they were 9, and when they were teenagers. So this is a little bit confusing, but this shows the relationship between nonverbal IQ at 2 and nonverbal IQ at 19. And so if we go way over to the right here, everyone who had a nonverbal IQ under 30 at 2, which is this rightmost bar, had a nonverbal IQ in the same range at 19. The green represents under 30. The dark green, light green represents 30 to 50. So if you look at the people who had nonverbal IQs under 50, between 30 and 50, most of them actually went down, but some of them stayed in the same range. I'm with this column second to the right. Then if we go all the way over to the left, the dark blue are IQs of at least 100. And the point here is these are about 50% of these are stable. They stay right there. Another 25% drop down to in the 80s, but some of them really sink. And these are nonverbal IQs, almost always of people that don't learn to talk. So we have more stability in the very low IQs than we do in the high IQs. And if you look in the middle here, an IQ in the mild range, which is between 50 and 70, could mean anything. This is a nonverbal IQ. Overall, verbal IQs are more predictive of outcome than nonverbal IQs. But at 2, a nonverbal IQ is one of your best predictors of possible language. So it's something to remember when you're testing little kids, is that if you get a 2-year-old with a high nonverbal IQ, you do have more hope because so many kids have very low verbal IQs. These are trajectories of the Vineland communication ages. And the width of the line represents how many kids are in each of these lines. You also see this is done logarithmically, so the difference between a 1 and a 2 is shown as bigger than the difference between 9 and 19 up here at the top. So what's important here? Well, if you look at age 2, even though this looks like a big difference, the lowest kids had scores of about 6 months and the highest kids had scores of about 18 months. So not a huge range when they started. And actually where you start at age 2 doesn't make a very big difference. But what does make a difference is what happens between 2 and 5. And you'll see that let's see, class 3, this group, and class 2 are making huge gains. The main point of this, this is from a paper by Andrew Pickles published in JCPP, is that the gains that involve significant shifts from being behind, which almost everyone is, almost all occur by age 5. After age 5, on the whole, progress is linear. People do keep making progress. It's not that they stop, but that the progress is primarily a straight line after 5. Now, we all probably know of somebody who developed very late language, so it can happen, but mostly it doesn't. And I think this just puts the onus on us to get kids in early intervention and make sure that early intervention is addressing communication. Oh dear, sorry, I got out of order. So this is going back to the 4 groups. Let me just go back there for a second. It's this group. This is going back here. And the point here is, if we look at Andrew's groups, that very best outcome group, the very low IQ group, and then the 2 groups in the middle that are different IQ, but also in comorbidity. This is predicting group membership. And the first bar is just by demographics. Second bar is by CSS at age 2, so knowing if they have autism. Third bar is IQ and CSS at age 2, and you can see that you can predict about almost 80% of the membership by this. This is age 3, you're up to 95%. Age 5, 98%, and 9. So one of the horrifying ideas here, I think, is that in terms of the group that's doing the very best, we can predict who's going to be in it, even very strongly by 3. That's less the case for the other groups, and partly they are more based on comorbidity, and then for the group 4, which is over here on the bottom right, it's based by lack of progress. But again, all of the groups are predicted above the 90% level by age 9. And I think this just needs, again, is a lesson for early intervention, not just at 2 and 3, but up through elementary school. We also found that we could predict adult outcome, that is, who was in that very positive group, whether with autistic features or without, by peer interactions. We couldn't do that from the data we had about peer interactions from very young kids, but that's predominantly parent report. But starting at 9 and then again at 14, we had teacher judgments of how connected a child was with their peers. And basically kids that were more connected, described by their teachers as more connected with peers, were much more likely to have positive outcomes. It also turns out that kids who had access to typical peers were more likely to have positive outcomes. But again, we can't say for sure what's the cause and what's the result, because it may be that the kids who got along better with peers were allowed to be in regular classes more. We also looked at achievement. This is age 9, and you can see these little red boxes here show this is where a 9-year-old should be scoring. And each one of these lines is different subtests on the WIAT. What we can see here is at 9, we have quite a lot of kids who are at age level. So they really are doing pretty well. And we have kids who cluster around reasonable, reasonably off. And we have a ton of kids who are above age level in certain skills. When we get to 19, it's a much more bimodal distribution. And I think the point here is that we do, and I think this does happen in school, but I think it's harder for parents. We do need to realize that these people are going to be doing very different things than the people who are scoring at a second grade level for reading, for example, when they're 19. And what happens in between? So we then looked at the trajectories of development in different areas, and we looked a little bit at transitions that we happened to be able to catch, that we could quantify. So the first one, and this is the work of Elaine Clark, who is a graduate student at UCLA. This is looking at Vineland daily living skills, doing age equivalents. And this is first building on the work of Vanessa Huss-Ball, where we found there were two trajectories. One where Vineland scores were steadily going up at a fairly high rate, and another group where there was much slower progress. And this is related to IQ, but not completely. When Elaine put in our new data, which is over here, and then added in when did people leave high school. So this is actually individualized, and she's just represented the data by here as their high school departure. We actually found that skills did level off after departure from high school, and that was true both for the more able kids with better adaptive skills and also less able, although the difference is slighter here. So here we need to think about what is leveling off. And at this point, we don't know in our data. Is it that people, just as we've seen in COVID, at least in my household in COVID-19, people are spending less time on hygiene and getting ready to go out to work, or is it that they're actually not doing as much? We also looked at BMI, so weight, and basically like everyone else in the United States, this is starting at young adulthood, this is 19, really it's emerging adulthood, and on up into the 26-year-olds, basically people are getting fatter. And there are more and more people who are overweight. And the more cognitively able people are actually gaining weight faster than the less cognitively able people. And there's probably a lot of reasons to that. But again, is something very important because this does put people medically at risk. It turns out it is related to taking antipsychotic medications, but in fact, those medications are more common in the less cognitively able group than the more cognitively able. So it doesn't account for this finding. And then we also looked at trajectories in mental health. And these are taken from the diagnostic scales on the ABCL and CBCL, that we have the CBCL starting at about 9 and then switching to the ABCL. You can see this is here. We also looked at trajectory groups. We found 2 groups. Again, this is related to IQ, but not completely. We have high attention deficit hyperactivity, which decreases, and then lower, which also decreases, but less dramatically. And that's pretty steady. And again, replicates findings of previous analyses where we use the ABC. Anxiety, actually, the high anxiety group stays high, very little change. And the low anxiety group, actually, this is not significant, but does look like it increases and then stays similar. Depression, the high depressive group also stays the same, but what does happen is we do have a significant increase in depressive feelings starting in the teens and in young adulthood, and then it looks like it's beginning to decrease as people enter adulthood. So what we're looking for now is what are the factors that are related to that. Where we'd like to get is what we'd like to do is be able to make trees for individual people and begin to think about what can help compensate if something else is not happening. So this is just done very early on with the 19-year-old data, and these are kids, this is language. So this is kids who between 2 and 3 show significant improvements in language. And so we've got this group here who's moving up in language. And then the second thing we look at is peer connectedness. And those of them who are described by their teachers as connected in peers are up here, and they have a much better chance at a positive outcome. For if they don't have peer connectedness, they actually drop down to here and are in the same boat as kids whose language did not improve, but who have good peer relations. I think the idea is some of these things we can make a difference with. Some of these things we are going to try, but we may not, but we could do other things that would help compensate. So the last thing I wanted to do was just talk about how can we use this information to do a better job working with families. And there are things in this slide that I haven't talked about just because of lack of time, but I think the point is that we want to look at, for example, early strengths that you could see even in a child under 3, like nonverbal IQ, motor skills, joint attention. We also know in our data that a predictor of better outcome, both in terms of very positive outcomes as an adult, but also in terms of higher IQs and lower comorbidities, is parent involvement in treatment early on. Between 2 and 3, that was a factor. And then basically the other big one is acquisition of structural expressive language. So it's being able to begin to create sentences by the time you're 3. You don't have to be at age level, but you need to see progress. Those things that were negative predictors that predicted slower growth were hyperactivity, and that was just a judgment by us during the ADOS at 2. General delays, so poor nonverbal IQ, sensory needs, repetitive behaviors, insistence on sameness. Then we hit school age, and there we think there are milestones such as academic skills at 9 start to make a difference. And then down here, we've talked about acquisition of social skills and more complex language. These things feed into opportunities, and the opportunities that we found are regular contact with peers. Another thing Nicole Rosen, one of the graduate students, has been looking at is siblings. Having siblings makes a difference. And then coming at the end of high school, beginning of university, part-time jobs. And then as outcomes, we're interested in dignity and independence, happiness and well-being, community participation. And then we need to remember also to help somebody be free from other challenges. And I think there's a very nice review paper by Lay that talks about various barriers, both internal, which could include, for example, depression, but also external. And certainly in the times right now, we're aware of access to resources and various forms of social injustice. Okay, this is a tree drawn by one of my former staff. This is not very scientific, but just the idea of beginning to think, where is a child on this trajectory? And if they're going in a certain direction, what else do we want to think about? So activity is a major issue, particularly for, well, a major issue in the early years for everybody. And then as we go into older years, particularly for lower cognitive functioning. Daily living skills can make a big difference regardless of what your language skill is. And then as we look at people with more language, we are more concerned, for example, about depression and anxiety. So let me just sum up in the last couple of minutes. I think that and this is certainly not specific to us at all, but subjective and objective measures of adult outcome are not the same. They are related, but they're not the same. And how happy somebody is, what their well-being is, what they would say about their lives is not necessarily related to things, for example, like having a full-time paid job, particularly for people who are less cognitively able. So we need to really think about what are we trying to accomplish? And I think we need to think about that earlier, not just at 19 or even 14. I think we struggle with how to measure subjective outcome. And I think we're aware that parents and people that can report for themselves don't necessarily report the same things. There's really a relationship, but it's not necessarily the same. I think we do need to remind ourselves when we're demanding things that the outcomes of people with ASD are not completely unique to them and that they overlap with people with other neurodevelopmental disorders. And sometimes we might gain more by working with other groups than against other groups. I think we also can't deny or underestimate the effects of intellectual disability. And by that, I don't mean having a nonverbal IQ of 60 when you're 2, which is not necessarily intellectual disability. But scores of 30 consistently do mean something very different than scores of 60 or scores of 100. It also is the case that in our sample, having an IQ of 120 is different than having an IQ of 80. And that would be true across in almost any population. So we do need to be realistic, but also realize that that person with an IQ of 80 has just as much right to a good life. The question is, where are they going to learn the skills and be able to use the skills that they have? We also can't underestimate the importance of language, trajectories of language, adaptive skill, and social development. And I think that particularly language, things pretty much have to happen early and we need to focus, which many, many other people have said. I think adaptive skills beginning in early elementary school are something that we should pay much more attention, but we also need to sustain it up through adulthood and not just wait for it to dawn on somebody that they really could take a shower without their mother measuring the shampoo. And social development. I think we have seen really nice changes in kids that were very autistic when they were really little. But those changes have occurred very gradually throughout elementary school and into high school. And if you look at those diagnostic changes, even into young adulthood. So those are places where we can have gains, gains that are very significant over long periods of time. I do want to caution you that this is a unique sample. It's not representative of everybody we would see today. We also measured milestones like peer connectivity, academic progress, decreases in repetitive behavior, but we don't know what caused what sometimes. And I think we need to continually remember the role of parents. I mean, 60% of our sample at age 26 are living at home still. And we need to think about maybe that's fine. If the parents are happy and the person is happy, that's okay. But we do know that people who are living at home generally have access to fewer resources than people who are not. I also want to say that we haven't quantified, other than intelligence, strengths that people have. I mean, back to Bobby and the boy that is now at home doing animations, he has a wonderful sense of humor. And I think that's one of the reasons it makes his cartoons and animations so funny. But the trouble is, how do we use that? Tommy, who was a swimmer, that swimming really helped him. And he actually wrote me a letter when he was a senior in high school. His mother, I think, made him do it. And he was saying, I am a great swimmer. I love to swim more than anything else. But my mother said that the role of professional swimmers is much more limited than the engineers. And I think I want to be an engineer. So, but that swimming really helped him. And I think other things that are even less quantifiable, like curiosity, attention to detail, and honesty, are really important factors that we want to be able to consider. And I just want to thank you for listening to all of this, all the people who worked on this research, and the families and the participants who have now put up with us for over 28 years. So thank you very much. And I think what I will do is stop sharing my screen, if that's all right, Alana. Is that okay? Let's see
Sure,
if I can find
absolutely.
it.
Yeah, that's
Oh, here, I should put this.
sure. That works too.
I'll
Thank
leave
you.
this up.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Lord, for an excellent presentation. So we'll turn now to our Q&A session. We've received a number of really great questions throughout your presentation. So attendees, if you have any additional questions for Dr. Lord, please go ahead and ask them in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. And we will save the last 10 minutes of the Q&A for questions related to career development for our student and trainees who are attending today. So early on in your presentation, Dr. Lord, you showed a figure on IQ and friendship. And we had a question about whether the chart suggested that autistic people with high IQ have more friendships than the non-autistic NDD comparison group.
They did, actually. So they did, which was really interesting. Now, remember that about 13% of the people with autism and high IQ, we think you wouldn't even know they had autism anymore. So they are in that group, but it actually was interesting that that group were more likely to have a friend than the neurodevelopmentally disordered, not ASD group.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. So I know that you mentioned that the sample may not be as diverse as it maybe would be today if we were to start this longitudinal study, but we did have a question about the racial and ethnic composition of the sample and whether there were any outcomes that varied by race or ethnicity.
Yeah, this sample, when we started, was about 40% African American and 60% white. We have actually we have one Hispanic child and one Asian child, both of them really mixed race. So it was, but what has happened is we have lost more African American families than white families. We've also lost more families with lower education, white and black, than families with higher education. So right now, the sample is about 25% African American. We have never found race effects. I mean, we analyze race effects continually, and actually, we have never found race effects in the kids, although the distribution is skewed. That is, we have fewer, more cognitively able kids who are African American than we do less cognitively able. And we think that's a recruitment effect. That is, we think that families were really encouraged, this is particularly in North Carolina, if they had a child who very obviously needed help, to go to teach. So it's not, I don't think it reflects the real population of the world, but it definitely reflects that phenomenon. The one place where we have seen race effects is that when we ask parents basically to tell us in what way their child has changed their lives, and we give them a chance to, I mean, it's sort of politely complain or talk about the negative impact of their children, the African American families complain far less than the white families. And what we worry about, I mean, that's a great thing, but we worry that they actually may get less help because they complain less. But otherwise, so far, we haven't had race effects. I think we really worry, I mean, we're a little bit horrified that we don't get race and education effects, because we do see these people, you know, these young adults now who are at home with really nowhere to go. But at this point, it is not specific to race or the education of the parents. Excellent. But I should say, sorry, I also think our parents are a particular group of people. These were people that 28 years ago brought their 2-year-olds to an autism clinic. And so I think that it's a very highly motivated group of families. I think our sample is less wealthy than your average autism sample. It's about half people with college degrees and up, which is low compared to, for example, SSC or a lot of the big samples. But even the people who did not have a lot of education or a lot of money were families that said, oh my gosh, there is something wrong with my child, I'll bring him. And then they followed up. I mean, that was what was amazing. And so I think how long this high motivation, high commitment of families can continue to pay off over the general unfairness of our society, I don't know. So we keep expecting to see effects, but so far not.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful answer. We have a couple of other questions about the composition of the sample. So did your sample include autistic people whose first language was not English?
No.
And were there any in the sample who used augmentative and alternative communication at any time point?
Yeah, we didn't have anybody whose first language wasn't English. So that I mean, there's a lot of limitations of the sample, and that is one of them. We do have lots of people who have been exposed to augmentative communication at different times in their lives. I think we do have a couple of kids who can type and can type long things, not terribly meaningful, but kids who don't talk very well but type. But we don't have anybody who is really, I would say, a communicative augmentative system user. But we do have a fairly high proportion of the less able kids have had access to different augmentative devices through their lives.
Thank you. And then do you, in your sample, have you collected data on sensory over-responsivity, and how, if so, how might that relate to some of the trajectories that you're seeing, or some of the differences in outcomes in terms of some of the co-occurring mental health conditions you mentioned?
We've collected, I mean, a variety of different measures at different times. We haven't done a really detailed study of the effects there. I think we did look at one point, we were interested in the relationship between anxiety and insistence on sameness, and then on sensory overload. And in fact, what we found was that they were 3 different things that all are related. And if you have all 3, you're really in trouble. But it's not the case that one predicts the other. I mean, otherwise, I would say we don't know. We haven't looked carefully enough. For example, kids that had higher IRBs, or not IRBs, oh my gosh, RRBs, either on the ADOS or the ADI at 2, if they went down, that was a predictor of better outcome even at 19. If they went up, it was not. But what we haven't done and we need to do is look at what are those? Like, is that sensory? Is that insistence on sameness? Is it something else? So there's a lot we don't know.
Thank you very much. That's interesting to think about the relation between those constructs. So we have a few questions about moving into and out of the autism diagnosis, which you spoke about at the beginning. Why do you think some children moved onto the autism spectrum? What might have been the role of changes in diagnostic criteria or experiences that the child had in their lives, such as traumatic events?
We don't know, I would say. I think we're just beginning to look at that in detail. We don't think it's traumatic events as far as we know, because we think we've been keeping track of major traumatic events. But I mean, I think part of it is, it's a good question. I mean, it could be diagnostic criteria, but I think that the reality is how we make diagnoses is generally affected by, say, DSM-5 versus DSM-4, but not specifically, because we really are giving ADIs and ADOSs, and then getting all information and pulling it together. And if you use that, everyone in the world would have autism. I mean, you know, the reality is you can find examples of almost every subpart of autism in somewhere in there if you were looking for it. So it ends up being much more of a clinical judgment of, is this different enough from the person's level of functioning? I mean, like the person who just got a diagnosis of autism, I did not believe it. I thought it was a mistake. And then when the team showed me the video of her, I was like, oh my God, she does look autistic, even though I've known this woman since she was 2 years old. And never before has anyone ever said she has autism. I think she, in fact, has Turner syndrome. And I think what has happened is she's gotten more verbally fluent, so she can say more what she thinks. And it makes her look more discrepant than she has done before. So I think we tended to attribute some of the difficulty she had to just general naivete, as opposed to the concreteness or lack of theory of mind and social awareness specific to autism. I think sometimes, I mean, we also do have people with autism. I think one of the things we're worried about who look worse at 26 than they did at 19 or 21. And that, I think, is related to environment. At least my guess is that these people are now at home all day, often by themselves or with an elderly parent. And that is not conducive to behaving in a more natural, relaxed, social way. So I think, and I think it also increases, for example, depression and anxiety, which probably make everything worse. But I think those are really good questions. And I think we just don't keep track of that very much. And so it's been a surprise to us, but interesting.
Thank you. So you mentioned some of these adults who are living at home and how you're starting to see some increases in anxiety and depression. Would you speak to diagnoses of those co-occurring conditions kind of across the trajectories, and about how many maybe currently meet criteria for those co-occurring conditions?
The proportion in our sample who actually meet criteria for anxiety is quite high. For depression is not very high. I mean, we have a lot of people reporting somewhat elevated levels of depressive feelings, but not over cutoffs, for example, on standardized instruments. And what's interesting is that we have, for example, hopefully I can remember this, we have sex differences in getting meds. So I think that our girls or women are more likely to be on anti-anxiety meds. The males are more likely to be on antidepressants, which makes no sense because the girls actually report slightly higher levels of depressive feelings. This is more cognitively able than the young men do. So I think that our actual levels of diagnosis, though, are not super high and are definitely not quite as high as you see reported, for example, in the big like Medicaid studies or studies of EHR. We think that's partly because our sample is not coming to help. Relatively few of our sample have psychiatrists. They're mostly getting meds from primary care physicians. And the use of meds has dropped considerably in the more able group, whereas not so much in the less able group, again, because people are probably taking them to doctors and asking for help.
Thank you. So this question relates a little bit to some of the things that you're talking about in terms of the gender differences. But here you talked about autistic people moving out of autism. What might be the role of gender here? Were things like masking or camouflaging measured or considered as factors?
We have not explicitly asked about masking or camouflaging. We don't have a lot of more cognitively able females. So I think we can't say very much about sex differences there. We don't have, none of the more cognitively able females that we have moved out of the spectrum, but since it's only 12%, the numbers just don't mean anything. I think if you saw the young adults that I'm talking about, who we feel like have moved out of the spectrum, they do not say they're masking or camouflaging. They just feel like they're living. You know? And I mean, when we were at INSAR in Rotterdam, I was concerned that there were a lot of self-advocates who were very concerned about how we talked about them. And so I was talking to a group of self-advocates and saying, well, what should we call these people who today would not meet criteria for autism, even though they could by history? And they said, well, ask them. So we did. And they said, well, I don't call myself anything, you know. I mean, this is just me. And some of them say, I feel very far away from autism. I don't think about it except when you turn up. And then other people, I mean, we have 2 people who have siblings with autism with more severe difficulties. And they say, yeah, you know, I do understand that it's relevant, but I do think about my brother, you know, or my sister. So it's an interesting thing. It's very different than the sense that you get from the studies of masking and camouflaging from adult diagnosed people. I mean, I do think you got to remember this group are people who've had their diagnoses since their whole lives. So it's not new. They're not mostly very few, some of them still think about it a lot, but very few. It's something that is just part of their lives. And they will say, recently we were calling them to ask them, you know, about our, you know, going forward, what would you like us to do? And what has the study meant to you? And a number of them said, well, this is like an anchor. You know, it just reminds me of where I came from, and I'm willing to do it. But it's not, you know, it isn't, these people are not going around thinking about autism or thinking about how they have to fake it. Now, it doesn't mean that that doesn't happen, but I think it's more relevant to the other more cognitively able people who are struggling more.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting to think about that age of diagnosis being young, at 2 years old, and how masking may be very different for those autistic people compared to those that are diagnosed in adulthood. Thank you. So thinking kind of broadly about your findings, your case scenarios and data seem to demonstrate that there may be kind of an important thing happening between those that window of 19 and 26 years of age, where things kind of start to go downhill for folks. Is that fair to say? And if so, what things can we as providers do to change this trajectory as autistic people enter adulthood? So how can we do things like promote peer connectedness, or you know, earlier on encourage that parent involvement that you spoke to, this so important, getting access to other types of services like therapy or PT, OT?
I mean, I think there's a lot we can do. And I'm sure other people have even better ideas. I think there is a cliff there where, you know, we had a lot of people who really did quite well through high school, and then high school is over. And then the options are complicated. I mean, an option is, you know, going to a local junior college is very different than going to high school. You know, going away to university is very different than high school. And I think families often don't think about this in a careful enough way about how is my young person's life going to change, and what do they really want? I mean, I don't think we probably don't think about it enough with anybody, because it's seen as a milestone. You know, I want my child to go to college, you know, but what does that mean? Where are they going to be living? What are they going to be doing? Why are they doing it? And where are they going to get the joys that they got out of high school to keep them going? And then what are intermediate goals for those people while they are in college? I mean, I think we really leave it up to the student, which is understandable, but I think that's asking a lot. I think we have seen people who, again, have survived it, and it's how they've done it has been very interesting. I mean, we've had a couple of people, I think we have 4 or 5 people who joined the armed services, which I was shocked by, but have survived, come out 4 or 8 years later, now going to college on the GI Bill, and not that I would recommend that for everyone by any means, but we were really surprised. They they were living places where that was a common thing for young people to do, and they did it. We have other people who joined fraternities, which is also something I would not have suggested necessarily, but where they became the accountant for their fraternity, and that gave them, a built-in group of peers. So there's, we have other people who've gotten into very particular interests. These are all more cognitively able people, but became a history fanatic, or again, coding, and found other people who did the same thing. And I think the combination of both peer context and some sense of agency and achievement has really made a difference. I think the question is, how do we make sure that happens, even not just for the very brightest or most talented of the people we see, but also for everybody, and also for the less cognitively able. I mean, the young woman who's on the farm, I mean, that was just a huge revelation that we should have known. She loved animals. There are many, many things she could do, but she was not in a situation where she could do them. So I think part of it is being realistic about what is somebody going to be able to do. Thinking about these transitions, like, why do we go to college? I mean, most of us go to college sort of to just grow up, I mean, we're thinking about it now. If colleges are going to be online, is it really worth $100,000 to have your kid sitting at home doing Zoom classes? And I think that is a really important thing to think. It's fair for people with autism to want to have 4 years to grow up. I wouldn't dispute that, but then what do we really want them to accomplish and how? And for less able people, I think I work with a group in Denmark that was actually able to convince the Danish government to let them run basically the equivalent of a 2-year college degree for almost nonverbal young adults with autism in their center, where they do various kinds of vocational learning, with the idea that other kids in Denmark get to go to university for free. Why shouldn't these kids have the same kind of experience, but then tailor it to what they might accomplish? So I think we need to think more about how to do that. And again, for an individual child, what are they going to get out of this? And it's going to be different things. And it doesn't have to be a degree, but I think it has to be something. They can't just go because that's what you do. I think they have to do things in order to reach some kind of goal, even if the goal is, better adaptive skills, or getting them out of the house to do something that has a beginning and an end, which will prepare them for work. So I think thinking about that more seriously, even with 9 and 10-year-olds. I mean, not that we want 9 and 10-year-olds to be working, but I think that we do probably spend quite a long time in elementary school having kids do stuff that has relatively little meaning for them. Kids who aren't going to be on the general sort of trajectory. And then what could they be learning that would give them a sense of accomplishment and a sense of, I can do this, and I can do this for myself and for other people.
Absolutely. I think that's really important to think about, those functional skills and what they're really getting out of experiences such as college and university. Kind of related to that, and thinking about that point as autistic people reach adulthood, which predictors or which factors seem to predict successes in terms of getting jobs and maintaining those jobs, as well as job performance, and which predictors may be hindrances or kind of predictive of struggles in that area.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, our predictors of work are IQ by far. We haven't looked though, and I should be careful. So we've just looked at a given point in time. So at age 26, are you working? And how much are you working, and are you being paid? So we know that some people's jobs are going to, I mean, some people will lose jobs and get other jobs, and we have not yet added that into the equation. But certainly IQ, I think also to some degree, social skills. I mean, the best predictor we have right now was the ADAS CSS. And that was a predictor both for the people with autism and not with autism. But again, that's what we were looking at. When we include those two things, then adaptive skills are sort of canceled out. If we don't include those things, adaptive skills predict. So if you don't know how severe somebody's social deficits are and their IQ, adaptive skills will also be a predictor. And then as far as we can tell, we do have a relationship between the sort of happiness factor and then internalizing, so anxiety and depression and work. But we have to be careful because we don't know what's causal. It isn't that everyone got the same opportunities to work, and the people that were anxious and depressed couldn't use them. They may not have even gotten them. So I think we have to be careful there. And then actually, I mean, again, academic achievement mattered. Again, you'd sort of think at beyond some level why, but the reality is that a lot of people with autism have some academic difficulty. You know, even brighter people may not be great at math or great at reading, even though we're so used to remembering the people that are so good. So that did matter in the more cognitively able people, and then the peer connectedness.
Thank you, Dr. Lord. So continuing to think about adults in your sample, are there data on the outcomes of autistic adults who got married and had children of their own in your sample?
So we don't have anybody who's had a child yet in the autistic group. So we are eagerly awaiting the birth of our first child. I think this poor kid is going to inherit a lot of grandmothers, but we have two people who are married, as far as I know, and we've heard from their parents that there's a couple others who are engaged, but it's low. I mean, people are getting married late, which I think is true in the world as well, but we're waiting, basically.
Thank you. That's exciting. So in reflecting on the various trajectories, for the autistic people in your sample as they reach adulthood, thinking kind of from an intervention and research lens, how do we use this information to really inform our understanding of intervention development and the assessment of responsiveness to those interventions? And then related to this, recommendations that you have for families of an autistic child based on your findings.
I mean, I think what is really striking in our sample is how little people are involved in getting services. I mean, and these are families that were so actively involved in preschool and school age, and now they're not. And so I think, and sometimes they ask us questions about getting services, and we just can't believe they're asking us questions when they live, 2 blocks from a teach center, that they were actively involved in early. So I think, they are in a different place than people getting, again, I think it is really striking how different this sample is than an adult who has decided maybe they have autism and sought out services at their university or from their has been sent to a psychiatrist or psychologist, that is not where they are in most cases. So I think one of the questions is, where do you find them? We just had a NIH meeting where we were talking about the need for samples that are even older than our young people. And people were saying they've had a terrible time trying to find samples of people that are middle-aged. And I think the reality is probably those people are, going to GPs and are not necessarily identified and don't necessarily think about themselves as autistic. So, I think that's one question of how do we make, how do we make the kind of services that would help them more available? And part of it is, again, working with sort of primary care to acknowledge, for example, if someone is depressed, no matter how autistic or not autistic they are, we need to address this. The medications just don't match up at all with, as far as we can tell, with what any kind of clinical diagnosis we would make of anxiety, depression. They are so hodgepodge. But that also may have to do with what the medications actually do, even though they're called different things. And then I think, I guess my bias is to be very practical. To try to figure out, for example, how do we make families aware that there are things their kids could do to get them out of the house? Both in terms of daytime placements of what could their child be, or young adult child be doing that would be worthwhile, that they would enjoy. We need those services, and then we also do need, places for people to live. And I think some of the families do feel like, look, he or she can live here forever. We've organized our house. This is fine. And I think if a family really wants to do that, that is fine. But it is more at risk, particularly if there aren't other family members involved. Because as you saw with the young man that I gave an example to, that can all fall apart almost overnight if you have two people, they're dependent on two elderly people, and somebody gets sick. So trying to have, I think we need more group homes or supervised apartments, more active supported employment that is sustained for the less cognitively able people, because people can do things, but you can't just drop them in and let them go. And probably some more specialized programs like the farm. And right now, I think states have very little funding, and they're going to have even less for this in our current circumstances. But I also think we've been caught in this thing of, like, you can't put too many people together because they should be in the normal community. And I think that's misled, because I think you could have a farm that's run by people with autism and intellectual disabilities. And if that's a place where they want to be, why prevent them from doing it?
Absolutely. Thank you. So we have a question from, I believe, a clinician in the audience who says that they hear a lot from parents who receive a level of autism severity for their child at age 2. So given the work that you presented today, would you recommend that clinicians hold off on this until a later stage? And if so, when might be a time to indicate that level of need?
Yeah, I try to stay away from levels of severity as much as I can all the time. I think that certainly not at 2. I think at 2, you can see that we can make statistical predictions, but who knows? I just think there's so much variability. And so I would be very careful about saying anything at 2 other than this is where your child is now. And if you have a 2-year-old who's functioning at a 6-month level, I think saying to the family your child is very, very far behind, but that's enough at 2. Without giving levels either of IQ or severity. You couldn't do severity of autism. In DSM-5, I think what happened, and people don't understand this, is that all of DSM-5 had to have levels of severity. And our committee for autism was really mortified by that because we were worried that they would backfire, because either you would have people judged as not severe enough to get services if they were doing well, or you would have somebody judged as in the same severity level over time, and someone might say the services aren't mattering. And so what we did was we made severity contingent on how your level of support that you need, with the idea that then somebody couldn't argue that they're going to take that support away. But it really doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's not very reliable. So I wouldn't even use those things. I think the one time sometimes I do come down on severity is if we have a child who is really quite bright and quite autistic, and we see them going through school and not doing as well as everyone thinks they should because they are so smart. I think at that time, if that child, that I might say to a parent, look, what is going on here is your child really does have very significant autism. This is not mild, you know, just because he's smart, this is not a minor thing. You know, and the fact that he's got all these intellectual strengths is wonderful, but he's also really got autism. So I think that's a time that I do bring things up, but I think that would be later school age. And even then it's just when I feel like people's expectations are way too high. And also then I think we want to say to that family, look, we've concentrated so much on how smart he is. Let's concentrate on how do we make his life better. You know, for example, if he has a lot of insistence on sameness, a lot of preoccupations, what do we do with those things? And how do we find him, you know, a niche that's going to be a positive niche in terms of social and in terms of self-esteem that really might be different than, you know, another kid who we toss into soccer or something.
Thank you, Dr. Lord. So earlier, I know you mentioned you met with a group of autistic women, and we've had a question about your experiences in incorporating autistic perspectives in this research or in other research of yours in defining these good outcomes, and just thoughts that you would share with us in pursuing the incorporation of these autistic perspectives or in working with autistic self-advocates and incorporating some of that into your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we really do want to include the perspective of both our participants in this study, but also other self-advocates or self-advocates, as well as parents, because I think, and I don't think we want parents to just overrule what their kids say, but I also think the reality is that more than half of our sample cannot really tell us themselves what they want. I think that we have talked to a lot of self-advocates. Mostly the self-advocates are different than this sample, so I do want to point that out. I mean, this sample are not people who have made their lives autism. So when we ask them, like, what should we do? They say, you know, help my parents more or get me better services. I mean, those are the main things, you know, help me figure out how do I explain this to other people. The parents have said over the years, have said to us, give us more information. Then they've said, give us less information. They've said, be more optimistic. And then they've said, be more pessimistic. But I think they've told us all those things. So I think that we do want to incorporate an autistic perspective, but I also think that there are autistic perspectives of the people that we've known for 28 years, and they're not necessarily the same as somebody whose life is making policy for autism. I think the self-advocates are a unique group, which is very important that we do want to attend to. But I think our primary commitment is to the people in this sample, you know, even though they're not representative of everything. They're, you know, and they have very diverse points of view. I mean, there are people who will say, I don't want anything more to do with autism. You know, I'll answer your questionnaires if you send them in a brown paper envelope. And other people who say, you know, yes, this is very important to me, you know, and I know that this has determined my life. But those are a smaller number, I would say, than the people who's, well, I think the extremes are smaller. Most of the people are more in the middle of like, what can I do for other people? Can I help other families? Can I help other young people because I got through this? And so that's their perspective.
Thank you very much. I think that's really important and helpful to consider. So we have received a number of really great questions from the audience about this topic, and there's clearly a lot of interest in this excellent work. Unfortunately, we're not able to ask all of the questions, and we do want to reserve some time for our questions about career development. So we do hope that attendees will tune in to future presentations for this series, as each will cover specific developmental time periods in further detail. You can see the next 3 up here on the screen. So we'll turn now to our career development questions, if that's all right with you, Dr. Lord.
Sure.
Okay, great. So from one student and trainee who has an interest in autistic and deaf individuals, they are looking into clinical psychology programs and are curious about that specific area of overlap and finding potentially someone to work with who covers that area.
I mean, what I don't know a lot. I think that there definitely are people very interested in this area. You know what you should do is email me. So, because I just received, in Britain, they've made an ADOS for deaf people and autism. And so I've been receiving it over the years, and I have it. And I also have all of the people in that working group, so I could put you in touch with them. And I think there's one person in the US who is on that group, but I can't remember who it was. I think my experience has been that places, if you're near active programs for the deaf, you know, schools for the deaf, or now, I mean, now a lot of places people wouldn't go to schools for the deaf, but at least in North Carolina, where I worked in a clinic, we were near a school for the deaf. So we saw deaf kids with autism all the time. And that was also true in Edmonton. So I think that that's partly what you want to do, is to pick places that are near deaf, you know, programs for the deaf, because they will have people with autism. And then seriously, do email me and just identify yourself, and I will give you the list of people that worked on this ADOS, and I think there's one American. So that could at least be somebody. I don't know anybody off the top of my head, but I think it's really important. And I think that you know, it's a very interesting question, where the overlap is, and how, you know, how having sensory deprivation, either hearing or vision, can increase the likelihood of autism.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lord. And I just wanted to say too that we will share the student and trainee committee email address in the chat as well. So if that student or trainee would like to email us, we could also connect you with Dr. Lord.
Yes, Alana can find me.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you so much. So thinking broadly, would you describe for us your career trajectory, and what were some important turning points or opportunities that you feel, looking back maybe, or maybe at the time, were really instrumental in your career?
I mean, I'll try to keep it short because it's complicated, but I think, I mean, so I took a developmental psychology class in 1969 from Ivar Lovaas, which was not at all developmental psychology. It was ABA with autism. And I didn't know that, but I was, you know, I just fell for the whole thing. And I was just an absolute believer. And it was when he was pulling kids out of Camarillo State Institution and going to, you know, with ABA was going to teach everybody everything. So I did that, and then I did it for 2 years, and I was you know, very careful with my 3 seconds rules and all kinds of things. But in the end, I was very frustrated. I had one little guy who was ahead of me the whole time. And I was constantly doing new discrete trials that he was actually quite capable of doing. And then I had another little guy who'd never talked. And so I really felt like, boy, this is not an answer, that something else is going on here. Even though I really learned, I mean, I was very lucky because I learned very basic behavioral skills of how to set up and basically a discrete trial interaction. And that I've carried with me everywhere. So I'm very grateful I had that experience. I then went to graduate school in Boston and was around, not deliberately, I was just in a very chaotic clinical program that kind of died while I was there at Harvard. And I was around predominantly psychodynamic people who could just talk a great story, but I also got really just depressed that it didn't seem like anything was happening with the kids that I was most interested in. And I've always been interested in kids who have big problems. And so I think I then, just by luck, my husband was teaching at Dartmouth, and for the last few years of working on my dissertation, I got a job supposedly as a psychologist for a program that was starting an early intervention program in Vermont for kids who'd never been in school, special ed kids. And the teacher quit. And so I ended up teaching this class, which was completely over my head, and I was completely unqualified for it. But it was an amazing experience. I mean, I learned more from doing that than probably anything else I'd ever done. And about half the kids in my class were autistic in various ways. I mean, some very bright. One girl who was just profoundly intellectually disabled and really couldn't even sit stably. I mean, I so much didn't know what I was doing, but I'd had this behavioral background, and I worked in daycares off and on just as a job. And so I just set up centers and had 2 teachers' aides, and we just had the kids rotate. And I mean, it was far from perfect, but I saw these kids every day. And also they had kids who had trauma, kids who were really neglected, who weren't autistic, and kids who had overlap neglect and autism. I mean, there was mostly kids from very impoverished families from rural Vermont. So that was an amazing experience. And then the last year I was there, I was just exhausted and tired of being sick. And so I worked at a VA, and I worked as a neuropsych tech. And there I saw people who had a lot of frontal lobe damage, which was also very interesting because they have emotional issues that were, you know, overlapped with autism. So I wasn't that focused on autism, but it just kept popping up. And then when I was ready to do an internship, I really wanted to go someplace where people were really good clinicians, but who were also researchers. And I just had a terrible time finding people who ran internships who really actually did research and who were good clinicians. The researchers were very dismissive about the clinicians, and the clinicians tend to not be very involved in research. And so I basically thought I probably would have gone to Bellevue, actually, and been involved in their inpatient program. But I got an offer from Teach and went down there and was just amazed. Partly Eric Schopler was still there, who was doing research, and they were so hands-on with the kids, and the clinicians were wonderful. So that was another major event in my life. Was they, you know, I had learned how to do a lot of behavioral things and a lot of educational things, but they really taught me a lot about working with families and much more flexibility in developmental approaches with kids. And the commitment to the community, which I think people don't think about so much when they think about Teach, but is really a major undercurrent to how it was created. So and then actually I had my first job at University of Minnesota in the Institute of Child Development, and there I learned more about developmental psychology than I've learned in my entire graduate career, because there were very dedicated developmental psychologists doing all kinds of things. And my graduate career had really been very pieced together around psycholinguistics and psychopathology. So I think all of those things really made a difference. Maybe the last two things would be, then I managed to meet Michael Rudder and become involved in some of the things he was doing in the UK. And I think he just systematically took on a lot of issues, like, for example, semi-structured interviews and how do you ask questions to people. And in those days, he was very interested in schooling and where does, you know, going to school make a difference, and protective factors. So if you have a kid who's lived in foster care, what are the good things that can happen to them so that they don't end up in jail or don't end up pregnant when they're 14. And I think that general sense of thinking about psychopathology in terms of transitions and major life events, and then also just clinical techniques like interviewing, was really important for me. And then I sort of cooked up this idea for the ADOS, which was really based, I mean, it seems hysterical now, but it was based on the fact that we had portable video cameras, you guys, which seems so obvious, but you know, we were seeing all these kids and I was like, oh my God, we could videotape them and we could save this, and then we should be doing something with them. What are we gonna do? And so I literally had a basket of toys that I always used when I saw kids for observation in the clinic. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna put this together. And then Mike had ideas and lots of other people had ideas. And that's where the ADOS came from. But it was like, we have to save this. So I think the one other significant thing I would say is, well, two others. One is, then in Chicago, I was in such a wonderful child psychiatry program because it was both psychiatrists and psychologists. There were researchers and high quality clinicians, and we were all right in there together. And Bennett Leventhal just fought to protect us. And we were, I mean, that was such an amazing experience to work right with other people who did very different things, the social workers and the psychiatrists, and genetics and pediatricians, but all right in there. And then the last thing I should say is in Michigan, I had students, and the students were amazing. I mean, having grad students is the best thing in the world. And so there I had an opportunity to have really good students and a clinic and a research program that was all mixed in together. And that was amazing. So even though that, and I mean, thank God I have a very supportive husband who has resulted, I mean, half the moves are my fault and half of them are his fault. But in order to get jobs for both of us, we have moved around a lot, but I think I couldn't have done this without him. And then I have 2 children who have actually turned out well. So that's made a big difference as well.
Thank you so much for telling us about that, Dr. Lord. You've had such an incredible career, and it's wonderful to get to hear about some of those really important points. So thank you for sharing that. In the last few minutes that we have, I just wanted to ask what experiences you would recommend for students or trainees or early career researchers wanting to be involved in autism research.
I mean, a couple of things. I think I would try to get out there and see schools if you can. I think that even though you may never want to have anything to do with schools, the kids spend an extraordinary amount of time in schools. And I think if you can be comfortable at least knowing what a really good classroom looks like and what most kids are experiencing, I think that makes a huge difference. And it doesn't have to be every day, all day, but it can't be just once a year for an hour. I think I would also, try to find mentors that, are doing something that you are interested in. It doesn't have to be exactly the same thing as what you want to eventually do, but I think trying to figure out what can you learn from this person, and then just try to soak it up. And it may be that from one person, they may be a great interviewer, and another person may be a great tester, and another person may be great at stats or getting things done. I mean, so I think thinking about, you know, what can I learn here, and then how am I going to do that? And then I would just stick up for yourself, stick up for what really interests you, because it's amazing to have a job. You know, at least I'm so grateful that I have a job I really enjoy. You know, I really look forward to almost everything that I do. And that's, I mean, that is so, you know, it's just such an amazing experience. And there's always more to learn. It's never boring. And so I think you want to find that. And if you are thinking about what you're doing and you think, oh, I don't really want to keep doing this, don't, you know, figure out what it is that, what is it that keeps you going, and look for that.
Excellent, really excellent points. Thank you so much. So I'd like to end this session by extending our gratitude to Dr. Catherine Lord, as well as acknowledging our working group and everyone who is attending for joining us live today. Video replays of all 6 sessions of the INSAR Institute will be available on the INSAR website following the series. The 2020 INSAR Institute session recordings will be available to current INSAR members as a benefit of membership. If you registered by creating a profile, there are many benefits if you choose to join INSAR as a dues-paying member. You can become an INSAR member by visiting the membership page of the website. If you have questions or want to become more involved, you can contact the Student and Trainee Committee at studentcommittee@autism-insar.org. We hope that you've enjoyed this session of the 2020 INSAR Institute series. Please take a few moments to provide your feedback in the survey that will be sent shortly. Join us next week as Dr. Jonathan Green discusses developmental science and evidence in early autism intervention. And save the date for our virtual Meet the Experts event, which is happening July 28th, 29th, and 30th for INSAR student members. An email with further information, including instructions for registration, will be sent soon. Thank you again to everyone for attending today. We hope to see you again next week.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Emily, I'm just gonna stop the recording now.